It was one of those warm, quiet evenings when the air felt still, and the streetlights began to flicker on one by one. A gentle wind moved through the small town, brushing against trees and carrying the faint smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. On the corner of Maple Street, a woman named Linda walked out of a small grocery store holding 2 brown paper bags in her hands. Her steps were slow but steady. She worked long hours at the local library and usually stopped here on her way home to pick up a few things. Linda lived a simple life. She wasn't rich and she didn't have many friends in town, but everyone who met her remembered her kind eyes and calm voice. She helped neighbors when they needed it, and she never spoke badly about anyone. Yet, despite her quiet nature, trouble had somehow found its way into her peaceful routine. For the past few weeks, a small group of young men had been hanging around near the store and the bus stop. They laughed loudly, played music from their phones, and threw trash on the sidewalk. Most people just ignored them, but Linda had crossed paths with them more than once. At first, it was small things, and a rude comment here, a mocking laugh there. But lately their tone had changed. Their words were sharper, heavier. She tried to brush it off, but deep down she felt uneasy every time she walked past. That evening, as she left the store, she saw them again leaning against the wall near the parking lot. There were 4 of them. They laughed among themselves, tossing an empty can on the ground. Linda hoped they wouldn't notice her, but one of them did. He nudged his friend and pointed in her direction. "Hey, it's the library lady," one of them called out. "Still walking home alone?" Linda didn't respond. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on the sidewalk. Her heart began to beat faster, though she tried not to show it. She knew from experience that reacting only made things worse. But the sound of footsteps behind her made her tighten her grip on the grocery bags. "Hey, we're talking to you," another voice said, this one closer. She turned slightly, hoping they'd lose interest if she stayed calm. "I don't want any trouble," she said softly. They laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind that made her stomach twist. She kept walking, quickening her pace, but one of them kicked over a small trash bin in her path, spilling garbage across the sidewalk. "Oops," he said with a grin. "Didn't see that there." Linda stepped around it, but the sound of them mocking her followed. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the empty lot. People nearby glanced their way but did nothing. Some looked down at their phones, pretending not to notice. Others simply walked faster, wanting to stay out of it. Linda finally reached her car, placed the grocery bags inside, and took a deep breath. Her hands were trembling slightly. She didn't want to cry. Not here, not in front of them. Inside the diner across the street, an older man sat by the window with a cup of coffee. He had a calm face, the kind that didn't show much emotion but seemed to see everything. His eyes followed the scene outside quietly. He'd been sitting there for nearly an hour, reading the newspaper and enjoying his coffee in peace. But now, he set the paper down and looked through the glass at what was happening. He watched Linda carefully pick up her fallen items while the group laughed behind her. His expression didn't change, but something in his gaze sharpened. He could tell by the way she moved, slow, cautious, that this wasn't the first time they'd done this to her. The man finished his coffee and stood up. He didn't rush. He paid the bill, thanked the waiter, and stepped outside. By the time he reached the sidewalk, the group had walked away, leaving Linda alone in the parking lot. He didn't approach her right away. Instead, he walked past, giving her a small nod, as if to make sure she knew someone else had seen. Linda managed a weak smile before getting into her car. She drove off, the sound of her tires fading into the night. The man watched her go, his hands in his pockets. Then he turned his eyes toward the direction the group had gone. He didn't follow them, but his mind stayed on what he saw. That man was Chuck Norris. He wasn't there to be noticed. He wasn't filming, promoting, or trying to be anyone's hero. He had come to town for a small charity event, a quiet visit that most people didn't even know about. He preferred it that way. Later that night, Linda sat in her small kitchen, sipping tea and replaying the moment in her mind. She told herself it wasn't a big deal, that they were just being immature. But a part of her knew it wasn't that simple anymore. She lived alone, and every night the walk from the store to her car felt longer. The silence of her house didn't comfort her the way it used to. She thought about calling the police, but she knew they couldn't do much unless something serious happened. So she locked her doors, checked the windows twice, and tried to focus on the small TV in the corner. Across town, Chuck sat in his hotel room, looking out the window at the quiet street below. His mind wasn't on the event tomorrow. He was thinking about that moment at the parking lot. The fear in Linda's eyes reminded him of something he'd seen many times before, in movies, in training, and in real life. The way bystanders looked away, pretending not to see, felt familiar too. He wasn't a man who jumped into every problem he saw. Life had taught him that not every situation needed a fight. But sometimes people needed a reminder that kindness and courage still existed. The next day, the town center was busier. There were banners for the charity event and people were gathering to see the guests. Chuck was one of the main speakers, but he kept his speech simple and focused on self-discipline and helping others. He didn't mention what he'd seen the night before, but his words carried a weight that made people listen. After the event, as he walked through the street, he noticed Linda again. She was standing by a small flower stall, picking out a bouquet. She looked a little brighter today, maybe because she felt safer in daylight. Chuck walked past her, giving her the same polite nod as before. This time she smiled a little wider. "You were at the diner last night, weren't you?" she asked. He nodded. "I was." Her smile faded slightly. "You saw them?" "Yes," he said quietly. "Are they bothering you often?" She hesitated before answering. "It's been happening for a while. I try not to let it get to me. They're just kids, I guess." Chuck looked at her kindly. "You shouldn't have to put up with that. People forget that standing silent can hurt as much as the act itself." Linda sighed. "I guess people are afraid." "Nobody wants to get involved," he nodded. "That's true. But sometimes all it takes is one person to step forward." She looked at him curiously, sensing something different about this man but not recognizing who he was. "You talk like someone who's seen a lot." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I have." They talked for a few minutes more. Chuck didn't pry into her life or ask too many questions. He just listened. Before leaving, he said, "If you ever feel unsafe, don't hesitate to ask for help. There's no shame in that." As he walked away, Linda felt a strange sense of comfort, as if the stranger's calmness had eased something inside her. That night, the streets were quiet again. But somewhere deep down, Linda sensed things were about to change. The fear that had been following her every step wasn't going to control her life anymore. And miles away, Chuck sat by the window once again, his thoughts steady and his purpose clear. He didn't know why fate had led him to that small town, but he had a feeling that his visit wasn't over yet. Sometimes life puts you in the right place at the right time, not for fame, not for recognition, but simply to remind someone that good still exists in the world. And for Linda, that reminder was about to arrive in the most unexpected way. The next few days passed quietly, though Linda couldn't shake the memory of that night. Every time she walked near the store, she caught herself looking around, half expecting to see those same faces again. The group hadn't shown up since, and part of her hoped they had moved on. But another part knew trouble doesn't always disappear. It waits. She tried not to think about it too much. Work helped keep her busy. At the library, she smiled at people, helped them find books, and acted like everything was fine. But deep down, she carried a quiet tension that followed her even after she went home. Meanwhile, across town, Chuck had extended his stay for a few more days. He'd told his assistant he wanted some time to rest after the charity event. In truth, he wanted to stay close. Something in him couldn't let go of what he saw that night. He didn't know this woman personally, but he had seen that kind of fear before, and he knew how small towns worked. People talked, but they rarely acted. On the third morning, Chuck went for a walk near the same area where the grocery store stood. The streets were calm and the sun was just beginning to rise. The air smelled like coffee and baked bread from the nearby cafe. He stopped at the diner again, ordered his usual black coffee, and sat by the same window. From there he could see everything: the store, the bus stop, and the corner where the group usually gathered. It wasn't long before he saw Linda again. She was carrying her usual tote bag and had a book tucked under her arm. She crossed the street, her eyes focused straight ahead. Chuck noticed how she walked, careful, alert, like someone always aware of her surroundings. He finished his coffee and stepped outside just as she passed by. "Morning," he said with a polite nod. She looked up and smiled faintly. "Oh, good morning. You're still in town?" "For a few days," he replied. "Thought I'd enjoy the quiet here." She laughed softly. "Quiet?" You must have missed the noise last week, I noticed, he said gently. Her smile faded. I try to avoid that area now. I don't want to cause more trouble. Chuck looked at her for a moment. You didn't cause anything. Don't let people like that make you think you did. There was a pause. She seemed unsure what to say, but his voice carried something reassuring, something steady. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, certain, like someone who had faced worse and still believed in good. They walked for a bit together, talking about small things. She told him how long she'd lived there, how she loved working at the library, and how the town had changed over the years. Chuck listened more than he spoke. He'd always believed people revealed the most when someone truly listened. When they reached the corner where she usually turned toward the bus stop, she stopped. Thanks for walking with me, she said. I don't usually talk to strangers, but you seem safe. Chuck smiled lightly. I'm glad to hear that. And for what it's worth, you're stronger than you think. She gave a small laugh. I don't feel that way. You don't have to feel strong to be strong, he said, and then with a wave, he walked off. Later that evening, Linda sat by her window with a cup of tea. The street outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own thoughts. She thought about what he'd said, how strange it felt that a man she barely knew could say something that stayed with her all day. She didn't know who he was. To her, he was just a kind older man with calm eyes and a gentle voice. But she felt safer knowing he was around, even if she didn't know why. That night, Chuck walked past the grocery store again. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just had a habit of walking at night. The streets were dim, but his eyes scanned everything naturally, out of old instinct. He noticed a few of the same young men gathered near the alley again, talking loudly, smoking, laughing too hard. They hadn't seen him yet, and he didn't want to draw attention. He simply observed from across the street. He could tell they were restless, bored, looking for someone to provoke. He had seen that type many times before, people who felt powerful only when someone else felt small. He decided not to interfere. Not yet, but his gut told him it wasn't over. The next afternoon, Linda's shift ended late. The library lights dimmed as she locked the door and stepped outside. The sun was already slipping behind the buildings, and the air carried that uneasy stillness that comes before nightfall. She walked toward the store to pick up a few things for dinner, unaware that Chuck had been nearby, visiting a small bookstore down the street. As she entered the grocery store, she caught sight of two of the same men from before. Her stomach tightened. She tried to stay calm, focusing on the shelves, pretending she didn't see them, but one of them noticed her right away and nudged his friend. She finished her shopping as quickly as she could and headed to the counter. When she stepped outside, they were waiting near the parking lot entrance. Hey, where are you going in such a hurry? One of them said, grinning. She ignored him, walking faster toward her car. Hey, we're talking to you. The other one shouted, stepping in front of her. Her heart started racing. She didn't know what to do. She looked around, but the lot was mostly empty. She tried to step around them, but they blocked her path again. Then a calm, steady voice came from behind. Is there a problem here? They turned. Chuck stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He didn't look angry or tense, just quietly serious. One of the young men laughed. Who's this, your bodyguard? Chuck tilted his head slightly. Just a man who doesn't like seeing people act foolish. The laughter faded a little. Something in the way he said it made them hesitate. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried authority. Linda's eyes widened slightly. She still didn't fully understand who he was, but she could feel the change in the air. The fear that had been building inside her slowly eased. Chuck looked at her gently. You all right? She nodded. I just want to go home. He gave a small nod, then turned his eyes back to the group. Then I suggest you let her. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The taller one smirked, trying to hide his uncertainty. You don't tell us what to do, old man. Chuck's expression didn't change. I'm not telling you. I'm giving you a chance to make a better choice. The silence that followed was heavy. The group exchanged nervous glances, unsure why they suddenly felt uncomfortable. Something about the man standing in front of them made their confidence shrink. After a long pause, one of them muttered, Whatever, man. She's not worth it. They turned and walked off, their voices low now, their laughter gone. Chuck waited until they were far enough before turning back to Linda. They won't bother you tonight, he said calmly. She exhaled, her hands still trembling slightly. Thank you. I didn't know what to do. You did fine, he said. You stayed calm. That matters. She stared at him for a moment, trying to process everything. You always show up at the right time, she said with a nervous laugh. He smiled lightly. Maybe just lucky timing. As they walked toward her car, she asked, Who are you really? He chuckled softly. Just someone passing through. She looked like she wanted to ask more but didn't. She unlocked her car and turned to him once more. Thank you, she said again. Really? He nodded. Drive safe. She got into her car and drove off, her heart still pounding but filled with relief. Chuck stood there a moment longer watching the road. Then he walked back toward the diner, calm as ever, though his mind was already working. He knew the look in those young men's eyes. They weren't finished. Later that night, Linda called her sister, telling her what had happened. Her voice shook, but there was also a spark of courage in her tone. Someone helped me, she said softly. I don't even know his name, but he stood up for me when no one else would. Her sister asked what he looked like, and Linda paused. Older, strong, kind eyes, she said. He didn't seem afraid of anything. When she hung up, she sat by the window looking out into the night. The town felt different now. Maybe because for the first time in a long while, she knew someone cared enough to step forward. And somewhere nearby, under the same quiet sky, Chuck walked alone down the sidewalk. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He just believed that sometimes doing the right thing didn't need attention, it just needed to be done. What he didn't know was that the moment he chose to step forward, a chain of events had already begun. And soon, the town would remember that night not because of fear, but because of the man who reminded them what real courage looked like. Days went by after that night, and the small town settled back into its usual rhythm. For most people, nothing seemed different, but for Linda, everything had changed. She walked to work each morning with a bit more confidence, her shoulders a little straighter, her eyes not glued to the ground anymore. She didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the calm voice that told her she was safe, or maybe it was simply realizing that someone still cared enough to stand up. Whatever it was, she carried that feeling with her. But deep inside, she also knew the peace might not last forever. She hadn't seen the group again, but she knew how people like that worked. When they lost face, they came back stronger, more reckless. One Thursday evening, the library closed a little late. A small storm was rolling in, the kind that painted the sky gray and filled the air with the smell of wet dust. Linda packed up her things, locked the doors, and wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck. The streets were nearly empty as she started her walk toward the store. She needed to buy a few groceries before heading home. At the same time, across town, Chuck was finishing dinner at the diner. The waitress smiled as she poured his last cup of coffee. You seem to like it here, she said. He smiled back. It's peaceful. She laughed softly. Peaceful? Not with those kids around lately. Chuck looked up. Kids? Yeah, the ones who hang around the store, she said, shaking her head. They've been causing trouble again. Some of the shop owners complained, but nobody wants to confront them. You know how it is. People talk big but don't act. Chuck nodded slowly, setting down his cup. He already knew who she was talking about. Outside, the rain began to fall lightly, tapping against the windows. He finished his coffee, thanked the waitress, and stepped into the drizzle. Something in his gut told him he shouldn't go back to the hotel just yet. Meanwhile, Linda reached the grocery store. The parking lot was half empty, shiny from the rain. The fluorescent lights above flickered now and then, making the whole place feel colder. She hurried inside, bought what she needed, and stood in line, tapping her fingers nervously against the counter. When she came out, she noticed movement near the corner of the lot. Her stomach dropped. The same group of young men stood there, huddled under the shelter of an old billboard. They were laughing loudly, throwing small rocks into puddles. She froze for a moment. Maybe they wouldn't see her. Maybe she could just walk fast, get to her car, and drive away. But luck wasn't on her side tonight. One of them turned and spotted her instantly. He said something to the others, and before she knew it, they started walking her way. Her heartbeat quickened. She tried to stay calm, gripping her bag tighter, her eyes on the car door ahead, but their footsteps behind her grew louder. Hey, didn't expect to see you again, one of them called out. She didn't answer. You too good to talk now? Another said. Linda took a deep breath. Please just leave me alone, but that only made them laugh. They surrounded her, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she couldn't move without brushing past one of them. She looked around helplessly. The parking lot was empty. The store lights were dimming as the last few employees locked up inside. One of them leaned closer. "You think you can ignore us like last time?" She didn't respond. Her voice stuck in her throat. That's when she heard a voice behind them. Calm, steady, familiar. "She asked you to leave her alone," the voice said. The group turned. Chuck stood a few feet away, his jacket damp from the rain, his expression calm as ever. One of the young men groaned. "Oh, not you again." Chuck's eyes moved from one face to another. "You had your fun before. It's over now." The tallest of the group stepped forward, trying to look brave. "This isn't your business, old man." Chuck tilted his head slightly. "When you bother someone who can't defend themselves, it becomes everyone's business." They exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the way he spoke made them hesitate, but their pride wouldn't let them back down. The leader smirked. "You think we're scared of you?" Chuck didn't move. "You should be scared of the choices you make." That line hit them harder than expected. The rain began to fall heavier, and the sound of droplets filled the silence. One of the men took a step forward, trying to act tough. "We don't need advice from you." Chuck didn't respond. He just looked at him steadily, his calmness unnerving them more than anger ever could. The man hesitated, then swung his arm in frustration, knocking Linda's grocery bag to the ground. Apples and bread rolled across the wet pavement. Linda gasped softly, bending to pick them up, her hands trembling. Chuck moved a step closer, his voice quiet but sharp now. "That's enough." For a second, nobody breathed. The man who had acted tough looked uncertain now, his confidence melting under the weight of those two words. "Let's go," one of the others muttered finally. But the leader hesitated, still trying to save face. "You think you can tell us what to do?" he said, though his voice wasn't as strong as before. Chuck met his eyes calmly. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm giving you a way out." The leader stared at him for a long moment, rain dripping down his face. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The others followed. Their laughter was gone this time. They didn't even look back. Linda stayed crouched for a moment, still shaken, still processing what just happened. Chuck stepped closer, kneeling down to help her pick up the groceries. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her voice trembled. "I think so. Thank you." He gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me." They stood there in the rain, the sound of it washing away the tension that had filled the air moments earlier. Linda looked at him with curiosity now, not fear. "Who are you really?" she asked again. "You're not just someone passing through, are you?" Chuck gave a small laugh. "I'm just someone who believes people shouldn't live in fear. That's all," she smiled faintly. "Well, you picked the right town." He handed her the last of her groceries. "Maybe the town picked me." That simple answer made her laugh quietly. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. He walked her to her car, making sure she got in safely. She started the engine but didn't drive off right away. "What if they come back again?" she asked. "Then you remember tonight," he said. "You didn't freeze. You stood your ground. You were braver than you think." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the streetlight. "You really think so?" "I know so," he said. She smiled, then drove off slowly into the rain. Chuck stood there until her taillights disappeared down the road. Only then did he turn and walk toward his hotel. That night, word spread quietly. A few people from the store had seen the moment from a distance. By morning, everyone in the small town was talking about the man who faced the troublemakers. No one knew exactly what happened, but stories grew with each retelling. Linda heard whispers at the library, too. Some said he was a retired officer, others said a traveler, and a few even joked he might have been someone famous. She didn't correct them. In truth, she didn't know much either. All she knew was that his calm courage had changed something in her, and maybe in the whole town. A few days later, Linda noticed the same young men walking down the street again. But this time they didn't look her way. They kept their heads down and walked past quietly. It wasn't fear she saw in them, it was something else. Maybe realization, maybe shame. As she stood there watching, she felt a quiet strength inside her. Not because someone rescued her, but because someone reminded her what it meant to stand tall. And somewhere nearby, Chuck watched from a distance, hands in his pockets, a faint smile on his face. He wasn't there for recognition or thanks. He just wanted to make sure peace had returned. When he finally turned to leave, he looked up at the cloudy sky and whispered to himself, "Sometimes all it takes is one small act to change everything." The rain had stopped by then, and for the first time in weeks the town felt calm again, but neither Linda nor anyone else knew that the story wasn't over yet. What happened next would not only test courage, it would show everyone the true meaning of strength, kindness, and the power of standing up for what's right. The street was quiet after the chaos. The cold air carried the faint hum of passing cars, but for a moment, time seemed to stop. The young men who had surrounded the woman stood frozen, their eyes shifting between each other and the calm figure who had stepped in. The man's presence alone was enough to silence their laughter. He didn't need to shout or make threats. He simply stood with a calm expression that spoke louder than any words could. The tallest boy tried to speak first, his tone shaky. "We were just talking, man. Nothing serious." His voice carried a nervous edge, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Chuck Norris didn't respond immediately. He looked at the woman, making sure she was okay. She was standing still, clutching her bag tightly, her breathing uneven. When their eyes met, she nodded slightly, as if trying to thank him without words. Chuck turned back to the group. "If you were just talking," he said quietly, "then you can walk away." His tone wasn't angry. It was calm, controlled, almost kind. But there was something in it, a weight that made them hesitate. For a brief second, it looked like they would leave. But one of them, trying to save face, stepped forward. "You think you can tell us what to do?" he asked. He was young, probably barely out of high school, but his pride got the better of him. His friends shifted uncomfortably behind him, unsure what to do. Chuck didn't move. "You have a choice," he said, still calm. "Walk away now, and this ends right here." The boy scoffed. "And if I don't?" Chuck looked at him quietly for a moment. "Then you'll learn something the hard way," he said softly. The boy took a step forward as if to push him, but before he could make contact, Chuck sidestepped gently, guiding the boy's arm away without force. It was so smooth, so controlled, that it looked almost effortless. The boy stumbled, catching himself before falling, realizing how easily he'd been stopped. The others froze. No one expected that. There was no aggression, no fight, just control and precision. Chuck looked at the group again. "You see," he said, "that's what happens when you act without thinking. It's not about strength, it's about control." For the first time, they didn't laugh. The energy shifted completely. They weren't looking at a man they could mock anymore. They were looking at someone they couldn't understand, someone who wasn't angry but still impossible to challenge. Chuck turned to the woman again. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, still catching her breath. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." The group began backing away slowly. None of them said a word. Their pride had melted into silence. Before they left, Chuck looked at them one more time. "You can still make better choices," he said. "You don't have to be this way. Life doesn't end with one mistake, but it can change with one decision." Those words hung in the air long after they walked off. The woman stood there, still shaken but slowly beginning to feel the weight lift from her chest. For days she had been afraid of walking home alone, afraid of being followed. And now, someone had stepped in. Not just anyone, but a man who carried peace instead of anger. Chuck helped her pick up her things. He didn't say much, just made sure she was steady. As they walked toward the main street, she spoke quietly. "You didn't have to do that. They could have hurt you." He smiled faintly. "I've been in worse situations," he said. "But sometimes silence helps the wrong people feel strong. You can't let fear win every time." She looked at him for a moment, realizing she recognized his face. "Wait, are you?" He chuckled softly. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said. "What matters is that you're safe now." They reached the sidewalk where the lights from passing cars reflected on the wet pavement. She thanked him again, and he simply nodded before walking away, disappearing into the quiet street as if he had never been there. But his words stayed with her. That night she couldn't sleep. The memory of the confrontation replayed in her mind, not the fear, but the way he handled it. Calm, collected, with purpose. She realized that what made him strong wasn't his ability to fight, but his ability to remain kind in the face of aggression. That thought stayed with her for a long time. The next day she walked to work with her head held higher. The fear wasn't gone completely, But something inside her had changed. She no longer felt helpless. She had seen what courage looked like, quiet, steady, and unshaken. Later that week, she noticed something surprising. The same boys who had caused her trouble were sitting quietly near the convenience store, not laughing or shouting. When she walked by, they looked at her but didn't say anything. One of them even lowered his head slightly as if in apology. It was strange but comforting. Change doesn't always happen overnight, but something had definitely shifted. Days turned into weeks and life slowly returned to normal. She often thought about the man who helped her that night. She wished she could thank him again, maybe tell him how his simple act of courage gave her strength. But he was gone just like that, a passing moment that left a lasting mark. One evening, she was sitting in a small cafe after work when she heard two people at the next table talking. "Did you hear Chuck Norris was in town last week for a charity event?" One said. "Yeah, I saw it on the local news. He was helping raise money for the children's hospital." Her heart skipped. So that's why he was there. It made sense now. She smiled quietly, sipping her coffee. She didn't need to meet him again to know what that night had meant. Sometimes the right person appears exactly when needed, not for fame or attention, but simply because it's the right thing to do. As days went on, she began to see life differently. Fear no longer controlled her choices. She started volunteering at a local center that helped young people stay off the streets. Whenever someone talked about feeling afraid or powerless, she shared her story. Not the dramatic parts, but the message behind it. She would say, "Sometimes you don't have to fight to be strong. You just have to stand your ground with kindness." Her story spread through the community. People who had seen what happened that night talked about it with admiration. Not because of the fight, but because of the calm strength behind it. It reminded people that real courage isn't loud, it's steady and quiet. Meanwhile, the young men who had caused trouble slowly started showing up at the community center too. One of them even apologized to her months later. He said, "That night changed everything. We thought we were strong because people were scared of us. But he showed us that we were just weak inside." She accepted their apology. She believed in forgiveness, just as the man who helped her had shown compassion instead of anger. By then, Chuck Norris had long left the town, but his impact remained. He never looked for recognition. To him, helping someone in need was simply part of being human. One evening, the woman was walking home again. The same street, the same soft glow from the streetlights, but everything felt different now. She wasn't afraid anymore. She carried herself with quiet confidence, remembering his words. "You can't let fear win every time." When she reached her door, she paused and looked back at the street, smiling to herself. Somewhere out there, maybe hundreds of miles away, the man who stood up for her was probably doing the same for someone else, and she knew she'd never forget the lesson he left behind. Strength doesn't always come from power. Sometimes it comes from calm, from patience, from believing that kindness is stronger than fear, and that was what truly changed her life. Weeks passed and life slowly found its rhythm again. The woman went back to her daily routine, walking to work, greeting neighbors, and spending quiet evenings by her window. But deep down, something inside her had changed. She was no longer the same person who used to rush through the streets with her eyes down, afraid of what might happen. Now when she walked, she looked up. She smiled at people. She carried herself with quiet confidence, as if a hidden strength had awakened inside her. Every now and then, she thought about that night, the sound of the cold wind, the fear that once felt endless, and the calm figure who stepped in like it was the most natural thing in the world. She remembered his words, simple yet powerful. "You can't let fear win every time." Those words stayed with her like a soft echo, guiding her through days when she felt unsure. One Saturday morning, she was helping at the local community center. It had become a big part of her life now. She started volunteering after work, teaching young people how to handle challenges without anger or aggression. The same boys who once caused her fear had started coming too. They didn't talk much at first, but with time they began to open up. One of them, the tall boy who had once tried to act tough, now came regularly to help organize activities. He was different, quieter, more thoughtful. One day, as they were putting away chairs after an event, he looked at her and said, "I'm really sorry for what happened that night. We were stupid. I don't even know why we did it." She looked at him and nodded gently. "You were lost," she said, "but it matters that you found your way back." He smiled faintly, and for the first time she saw sincerity in his eyes. People could change. She truly believed that now. Later that week, she decided to visit the diner where she first saw him sitting. The same place Chuck Norris had been that day before everything happened. It was a quiet corner cafe with warm lights and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. She sat at the same booth by the window, looking out at the street. For a moment, she imagined him there again, calm, composed, quietly watching the world. The waiter approached and asked, "Would you like your usual?" She smiled and said softly, "Yes, please." Then after a pause, she added, "Did you ever see that man again? The one with the hat who used to sit here?" The waiter thought for a second. "Oh, you mean the one who helped out during that incident a while back?" "Yeah. I heard he was in town for some charity work. Good man. He left right after the event ended. Didn't want any attention?" She nodded, smiling to herself. That sounded exactly like him. No fanfare, no spotlight, just quiet purpose. The cafe was peaceful. Outside, children played on the sidewalk, laughing. She thought about how easily fear could have taken over her life that night, how it could have made her close herself off from the world. But instead, it opened something new. It showed her the power of kindness, of stepping up for others. As she sat there, she wrote a few words on a napkin, a small habit she had picked up lately. It was something she did to remind herself of important moments. That day she wrote, "Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the voice that whispers, 'You're safe now.'" The next few months were filled with change. The town felt safer, warmer. People talked to each other more. It was as if that one act of courage had rippled through the whole community, reminding everyone that standing up for what's right doesn't always need a fight. It just needs heart. The woman became more involved in her town's activities. She helped organize charity drives, safety workshops, and even small events that brought people together. Each time she spoke in front of a crowd, she felt nervous at first. But then she'd remember his calm voice, his steady eyes, and she'd feel brave again. One evening, during a small event at the community hall, someone asked her to share her story. The room grew quiet as she stepped onto the stage. She took a deep breath, looking at the faces before her, some curious, some emotional. "I used to think strength meant being fearless," she began. "But I learned that real strength is choosing kindness even when you're scared. Months ago, I was in a situation where I felt completely powerless, and someone stepped in, not with anger, not with violence, but with calm. That moment changed my life. It showed me that courage isn't about fighting back. It's about standing up when it matters." She didn't mention his name. She didn't have to. Everyone in town already knew the story in their own way. Some had seen it happen, others had just heard about it, but all of them understood the message. When she finished speaking, there was silence, then gentle applause. It wasn't loud, but it was heartfelt. People stood one by one, not because of what happened that night, but because of what it represented. After the event, a woman approached her, tears in her eyes. "My daughter walks home from work too," she said softly. "Your story reminded me to talk to her about staying strong, about not letting fear control her." "Thank you." That night, as the woman walked home, the streets felt peaceful again. The same lampposts glowed softly. The same wind brushed against her face. But now there was warmth in the quiet. A few days later, while flipping through the local newspaper, she saw a small article buried near the back pages. It read, "Chuck Norris visits local towns to support anti-bullying and safety awareness programs." The photo showed him smiling beside a group of kids at a park. The caption said he had moved on to another town to continue his work. She smiled as she read it. There was no mention of the night he helped her, no dramatic retelling, just another small act of kindness in a long list of many. He never stayed long anywhere, but his impact always lasted. That night she stood by her window looking out at the stars. "Thank you," she whispered softly, knowing he would probably never hear it but saying it anyway.